Ladies and gentlemen, friends, both here with us at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem and around the world watching us on Zoom, thank you very much for joining us. It's evening here, so good evening to those of you here, good afternoon or morning, depending where you are. For those who don't know me, my name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Begin Center. I'm actually going to ask the people who are here with us, if you're not on my mailing list and you want to be on the mailing list for English events, both on Zoom and live here at the center, then on your way out, you can write your names on the sheet on the table over there. Don't do it now, I don't want to start. Okay, it's a great pleasure for me to be hosting a discussion here about Zionism, about what it means for the Jewish people and Jewish identity, and how it's presented in this groundbreaking new book by Gol Kalev, who is with us to discuss his book with really, I think we couldn't really have a better co-panelist for him and Professor Gil Troy. I'll present both of them and our moderator momentarily. I should add that one of the names on our list of speakers, Professor Moshe Koppel, unfortunately cannot be with us. He had a last-minute emergency and had to cancel. We're very sorry about that, but I don't doubt we're still going to have a dynamic and fascinating conversation. Before I introduce our panel and moderator, I do want to tell the audience watching on Zoom that you should write questions into the chat in your Zoom, and we will try and get to your questions as well as questions from the audience that are here with us today. Okay, firstly, the man himself, Gol Kalev. Gol Kalev has been arguing that Judaism is in the midst of a historic transformation and Zionism is becoming its organizing principle. He's been exploring this idea over many years in the America-Israel Friendship League think tank, which he's been chairing since 2011, in various position papers and articles, in a column for the Jerusalem Post and elsewhere. And now, for the first time, he brings together all these ideas in a landmark book, Judaism 3.0, Judaism's Transformation to Zionism, officially launched just a few weeks ago. And he is joined on the panel by Professor Gil Troy, distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University, an award-winning American presidential historian, and a leading Zionist activist. He's the author of several books on both American history and Jewish and Zionist themes. His The Zionist Ideas, The Visions for the Jewish Homeland, Then, Now, Tomorrow, was a 2019 National Jewish Book Award finalist and has become, I think, I would say, the go-to compendium of Zionist thinking, both classic and contemporary. And if you haven't read that book or purchased the book, you absolutely must. His most recent book, co-authored with Nathan Sharansky, is Never Alone, Prison Politics and My People. Let me just say, before I introduce our moderator, that the books, Gal's books are on sale after this event, and we have a special offer from Pomerantz bookseller in Jerusalem, downtown Jerusalem, that if you mention that you attended this event, you can buy Gal's book for 20% off. So thank you to Pomerantz for that. So finally, our moderator for this evening is Yael Rozenman. She's been a corporate executive and a successful entrepreneur in multiple industries, including food and energy waste management. She's spoken all around the world in a number of different languages, I believe, at TED Talks, the Young Presidents Organization, and other forums. She has a remarkable personal story. She's a Palestinian Muslim on one side of her family and Jewish on the other side. She was raised in Bolivia and has lived in her adult life in New York, Miami, the UK, Sweden, and now after making Aliyah in Tel Aviv. So I will pass over to Yael. Thank you very much.
So, hello. Can you hear me properly? Yes. So, I was born Yael Rozenman, Israel, to a Jewish father and a Muslim by birth, Palestinian mother in a very Catholic country. My parents had the very brilliant idea of allowing us to choose our religion, not realizing at the time that they already had given us the best gift of all, a deep belief in Hashem or God with all the rules or responsibilities. But anyhow, I didn't have that wisdom at the age of 12, so I decided to become Jewish. And let's face, the fact is that my lovely Muslim mother named me Yael, not Maria Teresa, and my last name is Rozenman, not Jimenez. So whatever had happened, this is where I connect with Gol and Judaism 3.0. The outer world did. So much for that phone. So, so this is where Gol Judaism 2.0 and I connected. Whatever had happened, the outer world already identified me as a Jew. And the Jewish world immediately would identify me as a Jew unless I showed off my heritage or they saw my mother's last name. And then it became complicated. It's like, oh, so is your conversion halakhical? Is it reformist? Is it conservative? What is it? Where are you standing in this idea? And the truth is, most of the Jewish world is now going through this process as more and more Jews become intermarriage, or most naturally born Jews become more secular. We have a new way of evolving and identifying ourselves as Jewish. And Gol addresses these and many more trends of how Judaism is evolving and how our anchor or cohesion is becoming more and more our national aspect as a people. This book ignites the necessary debate on how we're to preserve our heritage and our future. I've experienced this book in the making. It delves into many points that are deemed crucial to preserve our heritage and our future. I've experienced how the survival of Judaism in the diaspora is opening up questions of how we're to identify ourselves for our future, and how Israel is going to keep its Jewish raison d'etre, to keep a safe haven and sense of belonging that it should provide to all of us. The book is well argued and engaging. It really is 8 books in one. It's an analysis of trends in Israel, trends in America, trends in Europe, and trends within the diaspora of Jews, trends in Christianity, and trends with Palestinians, and trends with Arabs and Israelis, trends in technology and how these interact with the rest of the world. And it's all very well tied in the original vision of Theodor Herzl, the visionary of Zionism. All of this written in an engaging and very easy and concise flow. So before I turn to Gol, I want to say thank you to the Begin Center and to Judaism 3.0 team, Revaya, Merav, Ali, and Zev. So Gol.
Thank you. Thank you, Yael, for this very nice introduction. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Paul, for arranging this. And really, thank you, a special thank you to everybody here at the Begin Center. I'm honored and humbled to speak at the center that celebrates the heritage of one of Zionism's giants and icons, Menachem Begin. And when Menachem Begin was born in 1913, Judaism was a different type of Judaism than it is today. At that time, and throughout the 2,000 years of exile, 1,800 years of exile, Judaism had, the Jewish nation religion had two glues essentially. They had the internal glue of religiosity and the external glue of complete insularity. So Begin, when he was born in Brisk in Eastern Europe, he lived in a very Jewish area. His people around him, and he himself, I believe, went to synagogue, and the religious aspect was a key connector to most Jews. There were some Jews in the West that had since denationalized and became secular, but they were only a small minority of the Jews. Most Jews lived in insular communities in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. So the Jews had the internal glue of religiosity and the external glue of complete insularity. Jews at Begin's time in Eastern Europe didn't really have a credible path out. And that was the case during all those long exile years. On the other hand, there was no Jewish state. The national aspect of the Jewish nation religion was rather dormant. Begin was born less than a decade after Theodor Herzl died, after Herzl's time, and before the idea of Zionism and the came to fruition, before the Balfour Declaration and before the mandate. So this was a reality. This was a different type of Judaism, what I call Judaism 2.0, where it was glued and anchored in religiosity on the inside and insularity on the outside. While there was the national aspect was rather tamed. Today, it's the complete reverse. In that century, more than a century since Begin was born, the Jewish nation had went through a radical secularization today, very few of the Jews, different estimates, depending on how you count it, but a small minority of the Jews are religiously observant. And the Jews are not insular. They're free to live Judaism, and they have. On the other hand, the national aspect of the Jewish nation religion has been dramatically augmented when the Jewish state was established in 1948. And now, over 70 years since, it has become the most relevant aspect of Judaism. Transformations of this magnitude take a long time. When Herzl planted the seeds for this transformation by creating the Zionist movement, he recognized that this is not something that's going to happen overnight. Both vis-a-vis the Jews who have been living in the ghettos, physical or virtual, for a long time, and vis-a-vis the way that people look at the Jews. He understood that transformations take time, but also there were insurmountable hurdles in Israel's first 70 years that prevented this shift of consciousness about what Judaism is and the centering of Judaism around Zionism. And one of them was that Zionism had evolved to be a very secular movement, or at least perceived to be a movement that even rejects religiosity. That wasn't by design. That wasn't in Herzl's plan. And Herzl's made clear that Zionism is not going to hurt any of the aspects of the Jewish religion. In the Basel program that he created, he made that clear as well. But when Herzl, after Herzl's time, Zionism sort of shifted from being not a one-man show, but very much controlled by the vision of one person, into a movement that had elections and different people, got elected, and the party that sort of got into power was the Ben-Gurion party, not the Begin party, sort of the adversaries. I should say the Ben-Gurion. I think Ben-Gurion referred to Begin as the Chaver Knesset that sits next to Badr, so we can talk to Ben-Gurion as the Chaver Knesset that sits next to Moshe Sharet. The Ben-Gurion stream, what later became the Labor Party, was a revolutionary flavors. They rebelled against the old Jew, rebelled against the past, and part of it was the religious past. And since the 30s, when they won democratically control of the Zionist Congress, and through the 70s that they held power, they've pivoted Zionism towards a rather secular way. And this is in spite of the fact that most people, if you look at the history of the Jewish people living here, most of the time the majority were not seculars. And only between 1920 and roughly 1950, there was a secular majority in Israel that was reflective of the direction that Ben-Gurion and his party have taken Israel. The majority of Israelis today self-describe themselves as either Haredi, religious, or traditional. Roughly about 60%, according to the Israeli Bureau of Statistics. Traditionals, Masartiim, is what we call in America the Christian religious, so the religious Christians. These are the people who often go to synagogue every week, or mark Shabbat in another way, such as through a Kiddush. These are people who have religiosity high on their hierarchy of identities. And they, bunched with the Haredis and the religious, are the majority of Israel. But the Zionist ethos that have developed have, which reflects of the period between 1920 and 1950, when there was a mass migration of traditional Jews, what we now call traditional Jews, into Israel, mostly from the Middle East. During this time, that Zionism has pivoted to become a much more secular and even perceived to be rejected of religiosity, and therefore Zionism could not have been the anchor of the Jewish nation religion. You cannot have an ideal, if you will, that is rejective of religion as the organizing principle of Judaism. Well, now we're seeing two parallel processes. One is the long-term democratization of Israel, a shift of power from the secular minority. I grew up in Ramat Aviv in Tel Aviv, so I guess I'm part of this social group, back into the religious traditional majority, and certainly Begin had a role in it and symbolizes the beginning of this shift. So we're seeing, a shift of ethos, of Zionist ethos, from the secular minority to the religious traditional majority, but we're also seeing a shift within the secular minority and the emergence of what I call the datlaf, the tirefamim, sometimes religious, meaning religious seculars are no longer rejective of religiosity as they were in the past, but tend to consume religious experience a la carte as they choose while staying secular. They're not becoming chozer v'tshuva. When I grew up, the biggest fear that a Jewish mother had is not like in the United States that you will marry, a non-Jew. The biggest fear is that you will be lachzor v'tshuva, that you will become religious. One of the saddest songs in Israel is Uchazar B'Tshuva, a song by Arik Einstein, an Israeli legend singer. And he sings about his friend, who is Zohar, and others, and it's very sad. We became religious, Uchazar B'Tshuva. I lost you, my friend. And sometimes we hear the song in Memorial Days and in sad days in Israel. That was the fear of the Israeli, Zionist society, that somebody might, and therefore, secular, that 40% of secular Israelis were very worried that should not happen in my family. I hope to my children, they shouldn't join a cult or marry somebody they shouldn't or become lachzor b'tshuva. And people themselves, not were more careful than that. I live when I'm in Tel Aviv. I live next to a synagogue, and this is very anecdotal, obviously, but I've noticed that even like 10 years ago, when somebody would come to Bar Mitzvah on Shabbat, a secular, he would look to the left, look to the right, make sure nobody sees him, and then last minute put a kippah and sneak in. Now I've noticed people like leaving the synagogue and walking through the cafes next door while their kippah is, while they supposedly forgot the kippah. So, I don't know, maybe it's just, me looking for this, but there is definitely a religious trend amongst the secular minority in Israel, and they're not becoming religious, but they're no longer rejected of the Jewish religion, and therefore it's just one of the many trends that Yael said that there's like 8 different chapters or aspects of this book about trends in Israel, trends in the United States, and in Christianity, in Arab Israel. So we're not going to get into all of them, but just it's one of the that particular aspect removes a hurdle that existed from the fulfillment of the transformation that Herzl cited early on. So Zionism is no longer overly associated with religion. When you analyze, when you ask where are we in Judaism, what is the state of Judaism, it's relatively easy to make this analysis these days in the sense that about 85% of the Jews are either in Israel or in North America. So you can look at Israel, and I show in the book how Zionism is the national aspect of the Jewish national religion. Zionism is the common denominator that unites us here by self-descriptions, by voting trends. Over 99% of Israelis vote for Zionist parties, including the Haredi parties, which are Zionist parties, and Meretz. And the way that the non-Jews in Israel relate to the Jews is to the national aspects. Israeli Arabs that I spent time in the book doing some analysis about, when they look at the Jew, they don't look at him through a religious, which synagogue does he go to? There's a tendency, to look at the Jew from a national point of view, which is very much consistent with the Israeli Arab culture. So, Zionism is the anchor of Judaism in Israel, but what is less perhaps obvious is I'm showing how Zionism is becoming the most relevant aspect of Judaism outside of Israel, both to the Jews in the way that the Jews relate to their Judaism and in the way that people perceive the Jews. And the Jews are integrated today. As I said, they're not in an insular community. So when you do an analysis of the Jews, some people says, okay, well, let me analyze, let's say, American Jews by analyzing the 10 or 15% of the Jews that are actually engaged, that are religious or involved in Jewish causes. That's not the Jews. That's easy to do an analysis of them. But the majority of the Jews in America are American who happen to be Jewish. They're not, unlike when Begin was born, the Jew was part of the Jewish nation, and he wasn't Polish. Jews became retroactively Polish. By the Jew was never Polish when he lived in Poland, not to himself and not to the outside world. So somebody who was born around Begin's time, in Poland, will marry somebody from Belarus, another Jew, they will marry a Polish. Today, the Jews are integrated. So to understand the state of Judaism, you've got to understand the state of world trends and trends in America. And one of the things I say in the chapter is that, when Jews came to America, most of them came over the last 120, 130 years, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. When they came, America had a different narrative. And the narrative was a much more homogeneous narrative. The Mayflower narrative, the neighbor of the Jew was likely a waspy person, Mr. Jones, who didn't, it would be, unusual if the Jew who is a member of the Jewish nation religion will keep a certain affinity to another national concept, to Zionism, to the Jewish aspect of to the national aspect of his Judaism. So just like Mr. Jones went to his church, Mr. Goldenberg went to his church, to his synagogue. There was an attempt to denationalize the Jewish nation religion, which could have worked, but then the Jews concurrently became secular. So when Jews came to America, they were certainly part of the Jewish nation religion. They were still, in this insular state of mind, certainly the early Jews. But quickly there was a dual process of denationalization and secularism and secularization. And that was completely understandable because, again, the Jew wanted to fit in with the realities in America. Today, America is very, very different. So if the Jew that wants to fit in with the realities of America, and back then felt that he needs to suppress his Zionist or his Jewish ethnological national affiliation, today it's quite the reverse. The neighbor of the American Jew is no longer just Mr. Jones, it's also Mr. Rubio, Mr. Rodriguez. It's people that are whose ethnological national affiliation is very important to them. And that is the case because unlike in Europe, where you have basically a loose combination of competing narratives and groups, America is centered around a core trunk of Americanism. So a person of Cuban heritage can celebrate his Cuban heritage without, by doing that, is enhancing his Americanism and his American patriotism. And we see this, for example, in politics. In 2016, I got to cover aspects of the primary of the elections. And I remember Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio fighting it out who's more Cuban, not who's more Christians. At one point, Marco Rubio ambushed Ted Cruz and started speaking to him in Spanish in a debate. So to project this to the Jewish nation religion, it wouldn't be who's more it's the equivalent of who's more Zionist, who's affiliated with the Zionist aspect, the national aspect of Judaism. Same with Vice President Harris. She is very proud of her Jamaican affiliation, of her Indian affiliation. So for the Jew to kind of like say, oh no, I'm just part of the Jewish religion, that's now less consistent with the predominant American ethos, and obviously it's difficult to say predominant, but there is that is the sort of the main ethos in the left and on the right in the United States. Similar with religiosity, America is a religious society and an increasingly religious society. We tend to think of America sometimes as New York and California, but flyover country, as they call it, the South, the Midwest, and even main parts of New York and California are religious, and it's only an immigration patterns only are strengthening this. Americanism by itself is a religious concept. In God we trust, one nation under God. The sacred separation of church and state is there in part because the concept of Americanism and the ideal is driven and associated by faith and by religion. The Jews, the American Jews, under the old organizing principle of Judaism, under Judaism 2.0, when the religious aspect of Judaism is perceived to be the anchor of Judaism, the Jews are perceived, rightly or wrongly, to be sort of like flag carriers of secularism in America. That might be right, might be wrong, but in general, there's been, for example, a lot of statistics during the Corona time. Right at the beginning, there were a lot of Zoom prayer services, and some Jewish organizations showed a study how the attendance of Jews in those services is radically lower than general American population. Other, synagogue attendance in Jewish, in non-Orthodox Jewish circles is very low, while church attendance is high in other cities. So the Jews are, perceived, and I think, perceived correctly, to be more on the secular side of Americanism, while America is becoming increasingly religious. So centering your identity around your Jewish identity, around the national aspect of Judaism, around Zionism, is not only consistent with trends of heritage identity in the United States and the acceptance of multi-identities, as in the example of Kamala Harris and Marco Rubio, but it's also consistent with the religious aspect of the United States of America. You can be, if you're an American, secular American Jew, you can be associated with religion by being associated with Zionism, that, as we discussed, is now an ideal that is not rejective of religiosity. Having an organizing principle that is a secular version of religion doesn't really make sense too much. But having an organizing principle that's rooted in Zionism and the national aspect of Judaism makes more sense. That is how people perceive most Jews. That is a reality. When President Biden, in his acceptance speech, he said things that are very similar to some of the rhetoric that we say in Israel in sort of like a Zionist religious circles. He was talking about God's mission, and God's and America's role that God had given to America. So again, there is an emphasis on the left and the right in the United States on the religious aspect of Americanism. So American Jews centering their identity around Zionism, unlike in the past, is not sort of, dual loyalty flag, raises a dual loyalty flag, but on the contrary, makes it, in my view, more unison with the predominant American narrative. In addition, as Yael said, I analyzed trends in Europe and in other arenas. One of the emerging, trends is that we are, at the beginning of what could be the defining philosophical divide of the 21st century between Europeanism and Americanism. Every century has a defining philosophical divide. In the 19th century, it was monarchy versus republicanism. So, you had French, which was kind of leading in Europe, at least the republicanism flag carrier, and you had, other monarchies, and Herzl, before he came into Zionist, wrote an article about this amazing thing that happened in France. The Russians are posing up to France. The Russians, who represents a monarchy, is visiting Paris, which is, a republic. Wow, like end of history, republicanism and monarchism. So that's just an indication of how, how radical, how big was this philosophical divide even within France between republicanism and monarchy. In the 20th century, it was communism versus capitalism, and even wars like Vietnam was sort of fought under that banner. It's too early, but as I show in the book, one of the emerging trends, in my view, is the division between the European version of liberalism today, which is a distortion of liberalism relative to Herzl's time. Europe today is very much reactive to the two wars that occurred in the 20th century, which were completely unexpected. Nobody still till today can understand why World War I started, and it did, and then there was World War II. So the European ethos has evolved to become that of secularism, rejective of religion, rejective of ideology, rejective of nationalism, because the view is, the consensus view that has emerged, rightly or wrongly, is that nationalism, religion, particularity, narrative, all of those are the reasons for war. So if we have none of them, if we are like the John Lennon song, imagine, imagine no religion, no country, no nothing, then we will be at peace. That is, a legitimate narrative, of universalism that is championed not just by Europe, but Europe is sort of the flag carrier of it in the same way that in the 19th century France was the flag carrier of republicanism. And that is in clash with the American narrative, with the Americanism, which is about narrative, which is about ideology, which is about religion, as we spoke about, and about particularity. So you have, the Europeanism versus Americanism narrative, and we see it here. I think both Israel and the Arab world are very much on the Americanism side of the divide, and we see the European efforts out of a good spot. They believe that's the way to do it, but they're trying to promote their narrative very aggressively to our Palestinian friends in the Arab world, not to a particular degree of success. So if you're an American Jew, again, if you kind of have a shift of mind frame from, communism versus capitalism, all kinds of, if you accept that this is a particular divide, then certainly the Americanism side of the equation is that of religion, of nationalism. Nationalism, not in terms of, negative way that we associate with it, but in the way, in the ethnological nationalism that we described earlier, just like Marco Rubio is proud to be of his Cuban affiliation, and Kamala Harris is proud of her Jamaican and Indian affiliation. A Jew should be very proud of his Zionist affiliation. And an American Jew should be proud of it because, not just because he's a Jew, but because he's an American. Americanism, as we hear in speeches like Joe Biden and previously Donald Trump and people from the left and the right, is about a return, is about a fulfilling of a promise and a dream, is a form of abstract Zionism, if you will. So Zionism and Americanism are essentially sister ideologies. The United States is rooted in this strong ideological bedrock of Americanism, and the state of Israel is rooted in the strong ideological bedrock of Zionism. So as I show in the book, this, both for the Jews and the non-Jews, is a very natural way to connect to your Judaism through the part of Judaism that's relevant, which is Zionism. And let's say you accept that. So the first 2/3 of the book is describing this argument and trying to convince people that Zionism is now the organizing principle of Judaism. Then there's a question of, okay, so what? And I think the so what we'll discuss in a future panel that we're going to do in June, but I'll just give a little bit of a preview. It creates a lot of opportunities in terms of the Jewish clarity will provide, but it also addresses existential threats to Judaism. I do a threats analysis about Judaism in the book, and the primary threat to Jewish continuity today is what I call Israel bashing. Some people call it anti-Zionism. I think it's much more deeper than just anti-Zionism. I do a comparison of the early days of anti-Semitism in the early 19th century during Herzl's time to the early days of the Israel bashing philosophy, which we are in today. Herzl looked at anti-Semitism, and at his time, he thought that, he himself said he developed liberal attitudes towards anti-Semitism. It's not okay, you love the Jews, but you hate, maybe the immigrants who came from Russia, or you hate the rich Jews, or you hate, a subsegment of the Jews. He understood that what he called the opposition to Judaism, the European opposition to Judaism is chronic. Because at his time, there was a lot of people who said, there's no more Jew hatred, because Europe became religious very fast during the 19th century. And the opposition to Judaism, until then, was expressed in religious terms. Now that Europe is secular, then there's no more opposition to Judaism, to stop being paranoid. Very similar to today, that people are saying, well, Israel bashing, anti-Zionism, stop being paranoid. There's no more anti-Semitism, there's no more. So very similar, and you can do a lot of back and forth between then and now. But what Herzl understood when he sort of understood that anti-Semitism is not going away, and indeed, 60, 70 years after the anti-Semitism movement was founded, basically, it became the ideology for the attempted eradication of Judaism, for the genocide of the European Jews. Herzl understood that there is nothing we can do against it. He mocked what today we would call Asbara, Israeli public relations, which at his time, the form that it took was committees against anti-Semitism. There was all those committees against anti-Semitism that were formed by well-intentioned people. Herzl thought it was laughable, and you cannot convince people with dogmatic thinking. You can't change your views. And this is exactly where we are today with Israel bashing. I had even years ago, I remember a conversation I had with a colleague in France who explained to me that Israeli soldiers rape Palestinian women in Palestinian villages. And I told her it doesn't happen. I'm a soldier. I'm in Israel. Everybody's a soldier here. I couldn't convince her. She said, "You don't know. That they're lying to you. You don't know." And we basically agreed to disagree. That was years ago. Today, she's right. Since then, a lot of people had like different versions of that. But just in the last few months ago alone, there's a reputable European journal that put out an article about how Palestinian women are sexually assaulted in roadblocks. And we had a report by Amnesty that states that Israel is committing crimes against humanity repeatedly. So this is sort of for her, and I told you so. Like you didn't believe me, Amnesty says this. So this relates to the book in a very profound way, because once you accept that Judaism is transforming and Zionism is the anchor of Judaism, once you accept that Judaism is transforming to Zionism, then Israel bashing becomes Jew bashing. And that's important because we have an asset today, not just the obviously existence of the state of Israel, but the Israel and its friends, in the Arab world and in America and in Europe and elsewhere, have an asset in fighting this, cancerous form of Jew hatred, which is Israel bashing. And the asset is that today, unlike in the past, it is no longer fashionable to be a Jew hater. In the previous iteration of Jew hating, including during the the beginning of anti-Semitic movement, it was very fashionable to say, yeah, I hate Jews, and deservedly so. Today, it's not fashionable to say we hate Jews. Actually, people don't want to say that, but it is fashionable to say, we hate or we oppose Zionism. So the Israel basher must stay in Judaism 2.0 in order to be successful. So he can have it both ways. He can say, I oppose Judaism, as I've done for the last 2,000 years, through Zionism, but I can say that I love the Jews by saying I love Judaism. Once you accept what's in the book, once you accept that Judaism is transformed and we're in Judaism 3.0 and Zionism is the anchor of Judaism, you can only be an Israel basher if you agree to be a Jew basher. And then the apartheid, the Amnesty report about apartheid and crimes against humanity, let's have a conversation. Is Judaism an apartheid concept? After all, there's not, non-Jews don't have the same status in synagogues as Jews. Jews committing crimes against humanity, again, as they were accused of doing in the 20th century and 19th century. Once we recognize the transformation, it has implications to address the existential threats to Judaism and to unleash a lot of opportunities. But first, we got to agree or discuss if this is true and if Judaism is really transforming to Zionism. And that's why I'm so honored to have, as Paul said, with I think the authority on Zionism and on history and other aspects, Professor Gil Troy. So look forward to hearing your thoughts next week. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. I don't know about the authority, but I know I care a lot. And that's, I think, the most important thing. And I think that's what brings us all together. Thank you for that. Every author has to be the most megalomaniacal person in the world and the most humble person in the world. Because you have to believe, as you're writing word by word, that every word is going to change the conversation, is going to change the world. You also have to have healthy appreciation, having written 12 books, I know, that it's not going to do it. And that's the tension, and that's what brings us together here. Before we get to some of the many, many important issues you raised. I do want to address this on so many of our minds that we have 11 holes in our heart. We have 11 freshly dug graves in the land of Israel today, in the last week. And I want to specifically mention Amir Khoury, a 32-year-old Arab Christian who was one of the two policemen who went after the shooter yesterday in Bnei Brak, as Haredi Jews and Ukrainians were killed as well. I want to mention Yazan Falah, a Druze from the north of Israel who was patrolling with Shirel Abu Krat, a French Ola, in Hadera. And they were the ones who were killed by the two terrorists there. And those three names go right back to Yael's opening. Those three names invite us into the complexity of modern Israeli identity, into the richness of modern Israeli identity. I think we also have to take a moment, and as we anticipate the joy we're going to have, and it's so important for us to keep to the Shigra, keep to the routine. It's so important for us to keep to the calendar and have the joy of the Pesach holiday, have the joy of the Seder. But one of the things I'd like to invite all of you to do is what we used to do during the awful days of, I don't call it the Intifada because that's their term, but I called it Arafat's war against terrorism, Arafat's war of terrorism, Arafat's war against the peace process. We used to keep one empty seat at the Seder table. And it's something I learned actually from Seth Mandel, whose son Kobe Mandel had been murdered so brutally. And he came and spoke, and he talked about the empty seat at the Shabbat table in the Mandel family. And so every Seder we would keep an empty seat, and we would name it as one of the people who had been killed by these awful terrorists. And one more thought on that, just a few months ago, I had the privilege of sitting right here in another conversation about Menachem Begin. And I said that we're not in the world anymore of peace now. The Abraham Accords have shown that that's not really what's going on. It's peace more. And when I think about a Druze policeman and a Arab Christian policeman and a French Ola policewoman, I think that the world, and then I think also that split screen I saw in the Jerusalem Post after the Hadera terrorism, where on the left side, they had the picture of the terrorism from Hadera, and on the right side, they showed the Negev summit. And it's not Jew versus Arab. No. It's peace more makers, people who understand that the more peace we have with more people, the better off we are, and warmongers. And that's the moral line we have to have. And that blows apart all these Israel bashers and the apartheid lies. By the way, to stick to some of the craziness of this world, there was an award-winning essay at Hebrew University about 12 years ago that confirmed the fact that Israeli soldiers don't brutalize Palestinian women. But what was the explanation? Because Israelis are so racist that they don't rape the women. We can't win for, and I really like, I'm not good enough. I'm just not creative enough to be an Israel basher, which is why I'm an Israel lover. So I want to give you, Gol, the highest compliment I can give you, which is to disagree with you. Because I think, and by the way, that's a countercultural move today, right? The fact that we first talked about this book over coffee at Aroma. In the height of the Seder, you were actually one of the first people I actually met in person during the worst of Corona. And we'll continue to have that conversation. We'll continue to disagree. Is today, especially coming from the university world, is an act of tikkun, and it's an act of pushing back. And so I want to start by reading something, because this way you can also say, oh, I went to a reading tonight. This way it's much fancier than a panel. A panel is very Queens, and reading is very Harvard. Judaism 3.0 is a recognition that the organizing principle of Judaism has shifted from its religious element, rabbinic Judaism, to its national element, Zionism. This shift is occurring without any compromise to the religious aspect of Judaism, and indeed only strengthens it. As this book shows, Zionism is increasingly becoming the relevant conduit through which Jews relate to their Judaism and the prism by which the outside world perceives the Jews. Now, first of all, I read your analysis of American Jewry and I say, halavai. I think one of our concerns, and we'll get to American Jewry in a second, is that increasingly despite your analysis with which I agree that there is a different conception, the post-Mayflower conception. And by the way, who helped invent it? Jews. Historians like Oscar Handler. American Jewish liberals helped invent modern American identity. And it was a way of finding space for us and for others. But it's interesting, increasingly, we're seeing a core group of American Jewish leaders, American Jewish elites, those Natan Sharansky and I call the un-Jews, who may not represent the masses, but are trying to hold on to Judaism just as a religion in order to assert A, their Americanness, and B, their purity in this ideological war against Israel. But we'll get to that in a second. I want to start with Israel. But before I even get to Israel, when we think about Zionism, we think about these terms, we think about these words. I want to call out, PC today, I want to call out an act of cultural imperialism. All these terms, all these dualities, all these binaries, nation versus secular, national versus religious, secular versus religious. These are Christian terms. These are Western terms that are being imposed on our delightfully messy mix. And we have to be careful not to fall into it. We have to point out, for example, that the Hebrew word for religion, dat, is actually a word of Persian origin. If we go back 200, 300, 400 years to our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our great-great-grandparents, and say, are you dati? They go, what are you talking about? They don't have that word, they were just Jews. And so when I analyze rabbinic Judaism, and when I analyze Begin's Judaism, the Judaism to which David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin were born, I see, and it's interesting to use the word insularity. The word I would use is peoplehood. Now, I acknowledge that peoplehood is a 20th century term, and it's a Mordechai Kaplan term, and it's a way of us trying to understand this mix. But first, let's go all the way back. And when I try to explain Zionism to the next generation, both here in Israel and abroad, I don't know if you're allowed to say diaspora anymore, or exile anymore, or world Jewry, then they're world Jewry, but that doesn't include us here in Israel. So we'll talk about that in group therapy later. I start with Lech Lecha, a countercultural move in Western terms, because Lech Lecha, Genesis 12, Bereshit Yud Bet, says, leave your house, your father's house, your homeland, and I will make of you a great religion. No, I'll make of you a great nation. So from the very start, Judaism is this mix. Judaism is what I call this Oreo cookie. You have the cookie part and the cream part, and that's what makes the Oreo cookie the most popular cookie in the world. It says it on the internet, everything on the internet is true. But it's the uniqueness. And so I'm hesitant to buy into these Western Christian cultural imperialist terms. And when I look at rabbinic Judaism, when I look at what kept us going, indeed, you're right. Thank you, anti-Semites. They do a lot of work for us to build identity. There was, of course, a lot of piety, but there also was a strong sense of what we now call people. There was a strong sense of national. There was a strong, and the kihila, right, in Eastern Europe, and the dynamics that we had in the Muslim countries kept us apart. And it wasn't just because they hated us; it was also because we loved one another and we worked together and created our own little bubbles. So we have slightly different meanings of 2.0. And when we get to 3.0, again, I see the dance. And the way I see the complexity, by the way, I love your story about the Israeli parents who worry about the kids, American Jews have it much worse. American Jews are much more neurotic about what their kids will be doing. I just had a deal with a bunch of friends last week, most of us Olim, and we talked about how among our peers in America, there's a constant worry about, oh, will they be Jewish? Will the kids be Jewish? Will the grandkids be Jewish? And here, not such a big issue, right? But what's the typical Jewish parent, both here and there and everywhere, is we all juggle this very elaborate set of balls. And God forbid they go to the left, and God forbid they go to the right. I know one family where one daughter intermarried, oh my goodness, Ashanda. Another one went Haredi, oh my goodness, Ashanda, right? You have to keep it going, and it's very exhausting to kind of buy into every one of your parents' parents' bizarre compromises. But when I look at that and I try to explain it, I see delightful confusion. And I agree with you. I think that there's a tendency, which you don't fall into, to overstep the religious secular divide here in Israel. And that is a very old-fashioned concept from the 1950s, when you did have the kibbutznikim who would eat the ham sandwich twice a year. And they didn't like ham, right? But they had the ham and cheese sandwich on Yom Kippur and on Pesach, right? But that in itself, that rebellion is an act of literacy, right? That's an act of true apikorsu, right? And it's an act of true engagement, because you're rebelling with a sophistication that the next generation of American Jews doesn't have. And I love the fact that my Israeli friends say, I go, great. There's a hot new restaurant that just opened up in Tel Aviv. I can only get reservations 7 o'clock on Friday night. Will you join me? I can't do that. And I go, why not? They go, my mother will kill me. And I go, why? Why? They said, I'll go clubbing you at 10, right? But at 7 o'clock, where do you have to be? And indeed, the numbers show you have to be at our Shabbat. And 60 to 70% of Israelis will raise a glass. Most of them will say a bracha, right? And we know that, God forbid, there's a tragedy. They sit Shiva. Now in America, you get a 2 and 3 day discount. No, they do the whole full 7 days. I also love the Israeli males game with the kippah. We were in Eilat a few years ago in December, and Chabad, of course, had this menorah bigger than the World Trade Center. We can't say that anymore. Bigger than the Empire State Building. And what were all the Israeli men doing? They go into their pockets, they find something, they put on their head, right? Because they know you have to cover your head. That also is an act of cultural literacy, but also an act of respect. And so I look at my Chiloni Israeli friends, I say, you're the worst secular ever. You don't know secular. Come to New York, I'll show you secular. So your typical Israeli, and we're not talking about the Haredim, and by the way, I don't think some of those parties are Zionist. And we'll have to argue about that too. The typical Israeli who's not religious, who defines themselves very much as not religious, because we have to also talk about the harm that the Rabbanut has done in creating this binary world and in making so much of Jewish religion, so much of the beauty of Jewish religion look ugly and unkosher. I use those words on purpose. The typical Israeli has a lot of Jewish content in his or her life, but very little consciousness of it. It's just there. What do you do in Shavuot? You have cheesecake. Why? I don't know. It's good. Right? But most Americans don't even know that there's Shavuot. And they certainly don't know anything about cheesecake. So if the Israelis, and of course we're overgeneralizing, right? But the non-religious, those Israelis who call themselves Chiloni have content but no consciousness. Increasingly in America, we're seeing consciousness but no content. A generation that doesn't know how to ask even the basic questions. My favorite story about that is when they launched this amazing program, which I'm so honored to volunteer for, Birthright to Lead. And they had these big ads in newspapers saying, Shana Tova for a free trip to Israel, email, lead whatever, gmail.com, blah, blah, blah. And Giddy Mark, the CEO of Birthright, says, we got letters, dear Mr. Tova, thank you very much for that offer. Right? So like the most basic literacy is gone. And we're seeing that especially with the 3rd and 4th generation. And here again, where we disagree is that my reading of what's going on in America is that it's true, while there was this revolution in America which carved out more places for you to have this kind of Zionist identity, what's happened in American Jewry, and again, particularly in the elites of American Jewry, non-Orthodox, which is 80% of the of American Jewry, is a desire to be so purely American that you reduce your Judaism just to a religion. So you smash the Oreo cookie and you only take one part. And as a result, you have a cookie which doesn't taste as good because you don't have those 2 parts. And the fact that it's coming from the heart of the Reform Rabbinic seminaries and the conservative movement is the most Zionist of the streams, way more Zionist than the Orthodox movement at the turn of the century. Right? But Salman Schechter, conservative Jewry, Jewish intellectual conservative Jewry, the conservative Jewry which I grew up was fundamentally peoplehood oriented, fundamentally nationalist, fundamentally Oreo cookieist. And to see that there hasn't been one person kicked out of the JTS on doctrinal grounds in decades. I looked into this, right? When there are now conservative rabbis who call themselves anti-Zionist. To me, it's like a Jesuit priest saying, I don't believe in Jesus. You can be a nice person. I'm happy to have coffee with you, right? I'll give you even an A in a paper as an academic in my graduate seminar on American history or American religion or Judaism, but I don't understand how you can become a conservative rabbi if you don't believe in the, not just the kashrut, but the holiness and the organic integrity of the Oreo cookie. And so the work we have to do in America is say, but wait a minute, look what's going on here. Indeed, you're right. The percentages show that more and more American Jews don't believe in God. And they've jumped ahead of their non-Jewish neighbors, right? Because, right, I've often called the United States the Ireland of North America, right? Because there is a strong sense of religiosity. There is this growing secularism. But Jews have been in the forefront of that. Jews are starting to say, and Jews don't believe in God and they don't keep kosher. And if you see the Pew study, right, by the way, it's really funny because these studies were around for years before, but it's done by Jews. As soon as non-Jews did it, it appeared in the New York Times, then it became an issue. So the Pew study is only building on the work of Stephen Cohn and Len Sachs and so many others. But what do they show? The Holocaust. Remember the Holocaust. That's the way you, and you're funny, right? Those are the things that are essential to your Jewish identity. But what's going on there? It's really interesting. When they fill out the census survey, they click, my religion is Judaism, but they're not very religious. So they have a consciousness of their Jewish religiosity, but a lack of content. And I do agree with you, or I would fundamentally agree, is I think this is an extraordinary educational opportunity. So, because I don't want to take too much time, I'm just going to give two more frameworks and then open up or return the serve. So the way I make sense of this, beyond the Oreo cookie, is two ways. One is when I would never have had the nerve to update the Zionist idea, which I grew up as the Bible, for the Zionist Bible. But when I was asked to do it, and I was writing the introduction, and by the way, don't read my introduction. Go to the Zionist idea. Don't read the Zionist idea. Just read Arthur Herzl's 100-page introduction to not just the history, but the historiography of Zionism. And he talks about Zionism being a twice-born movement. And I talk about it being a thrice-born movement. And I think it relates directly to this paragraph that I read. First, Abraham. And in Abraham, we see all the elements. We see the religiosity, and we see the peoplehood dimension, which we call national dimension, and we see this delightful confusion. But we also see something, a word I don't think we've mentioned tonight, which is land. And so what's really born in the Bible is the holy Jewish Trinity of people, God, and land. And you can tell the entire story of Judaism and of the Jewish people by looking at those three parts and looking at the relationship at different times to those three parts. Land, God, and people. And that's the core. And then indeed there's exile, so if you, the land people connection is broken in real time. Although of course we always have to emphasize that there was still a core group of people who lived on this land, a core group of Jews who continued to live on this land. And of course we as Jews kept the conceptual tie alive because we all prayed no matter where we were. We could have been in Morocco, we could have been in Russia, we could have been, of course, in holy Ukraine with the anti-Semitism, not just from Zelensky. And we all turned to Jerusalem, we all turned to Zion, so we never gave up on it. But that was weakened. And so the second birth of the movement, the first birth is Abraham and Sarah. The second birth of the movement is the 19th century, when Italy is becoming, when Italians are forming and making Italy, and French are becoming French. And Herzl talks about this, right? And he says, we are a people. We too are a people. But it happened before Herzl. It happens when Moses Hess in 1862 writes Rome and Jerusalem. It happens in the 1850s and 1860s, and that's why you'll even have a Beulah movement going in the 1880s. So in the 19th century, you have the sense of what we now call peoplehood, the sense of nationhood born as Europe is going more nationalist as that, and as Romanticism reigns. And then Herzl's great jump is another word we haven't talked about much, which is statehood. And so if the first birth is the whole beautiful mix, the second rebirth is the birth emphasizing peoplehood, nationhood. Herzl brings in to the mixed statehood. And so that's the flow that I try to invite my students to appreciate. And what I like about my perspective is, and feel free to disagree, but what I like about it is I like the confusion. I like pushing back against the binary categories, the clean, neat Christian categories, the clean, neat Western categories, and say, we are Jews. Michael Walzer, the great political philosopher, says, are we anomalous in this context? Yes. Do we confuse you? Yes. But I'm not going to apologize for that. And I think that's also one of the things we learned from Herzl. We're not going to apologize for it. We're going to be proud. We're going to be strong. We're going to have a sense of honor. And we're going to both agree to disagree, but also agree to agree. So Mazal Tov on this. And thank you for inspiring me and stimulating me and triggering me to think about all these great ideas.
Thank you. Can I react just very briefly? First of all, where do we disagree? I've been having a battle with this bottle of water. Just maybe two quick points about something that you said is when you talked about the hand sandwich, that by virtue it almost like proves my or gives evidence to my point that we've shifted from Judaism 2.0 to Judaism 3.0, from having the religious aspect of Judaism as the anchor to the national one. Because in Judaism 2.0, you said, if I can quote you right, that by eating a ham sandwich on Yom Kippur and on Pesach, you expressed your consciousness of being Jewish. It was sort of through the religious aspect. Today we're seeing the same thing. And what the number one aspect of many of my friends' connection to Judaism is criticism of Israel. Criticism of Israel has become the vehicle through which a lot of Jews connect to Judaism. Now, it's maybe not good for Israeli PR, but it's evidence for my view. It supports the view that Zionism is the most relevant aspect of Judaism. So we've seen over the last conflict in May, a lot of Jews write posts, as a Jew, I'm embarrassed about Israel. As a Jew. They never write, as a Jew, this is my view about the kashrut, and they don't write as a Jew about the Holocaust. The Holocaust and the memory of the Eastern European kind of heritage was relevant when that generation was alive. And when you had a Jewish grandmother who was there to remind you that Hitler tried to kill us and you must stay Jewish, and that's, you don't have that anymore. The 20-year-old's grandmother is an American grandmother, who, just like the Italian and Irish 20-year-old, his grandmother also was born in America. So Israel is what draws the Jew into his Judaism in the negative as well. If you have a Jewish last name and you walk into a college campus and somebody yells at you, your people are murdering the Palestinians, you have to react. You have to have some sort of a reaction. You can try to avoid him. You can say, I agree. You can say, I disagree. But this is, and that's what I try to show in the book, that one way or another, through positive and negative, that's what draws you into your Judaism. And that's how people look at you, in positive and negative alike. I've done an unacademic survey of some of the far-right websites, and even more than far-right, when they talk about George Soros, and when I talk about the New York Times, that we in Israel like to think as anti-Israeli and certainly not Zionists. What is one of the main slurs they use? Zionists against Soros, against the New York Times, Zionist conspirators or Zionists. So whether we like it or not, I'm not saying this is the way it should be. I'm saying that we are transforming and that there is a shift in global consciousness of what Judaism is. And it is Zionism. And that's what I'm trying to show in the book. And that relates to what I said at the end, and we'll do a separate discussion about that, about the issue of Israel bashing, because again, once there is a shift of global consciousness of what Judaism is, and it's Zionism, which is its anchor, then it puts a different light on Israel bashing. And that relates to something else you said about Herzl and Moshe Hass. Moshe Hass, in 1860, when he wrote Roman Jerusalem, made a mistake that Herzl corrected. And the mistake was that Hass thought that once those processes that you described, once the Italian liberal forces and national forces that were correlated will rise and the power of the church will recede, that everything will be fine, because hatred was expressed through the religious aspect of Europe at that time. Herzl corrected him essentially, not by calling him, but identifying the chronic nature of this opposition, and that opposition to Judaism will evolve as European circumstances change and as Jewish circumstances change, and it is exactly what we have today. Today, it's not just Europe. In Herzl's time and to the Middle Ages, the Jews were mostly in Europe, and Europe dominated the world. Today, it's we can call it European sphere of influence, but the opposition takes the flavor of the opposer, be it human rights or whatever it is that people care about, and it's relevant to the most relevant aspect of Judaism, which is the Jewish state. So again, it helps define Judaism from the outside.
Well, do you want to respond?
Just two quick things. One is where we disagree is, look, I think we both see how central Zionism and nationalism and peoplehood is to modern Jewish identity.
Mhm.
But where I'm a little uncomfortable with some of the analysis is in this either orness,
Mhm.
that you're sort of putting a competition and saying religion is down, nation is up, nation is down, religion is up, and that's where I'm encouraging you to look more at the cross-wired nature of it, because I think in the same way that if I'm drowning and somebody throws a life raft, and if there's just one little strand and I pull it, I'm in trouble. But if there are two strands and they're intertwined, it's that much stronger. And that dance between religion and nation, and then we add state, and then we add land, right? The more strands we have, and the more confusion we have, the stronger is our identity. And one of there was a fascinating study of Canadian Jewry. I can say we, as an American Jew and as a Canadian Jew and as an Israeli Jew, because I've paid taxes in all three places. It costs a lot of money. So the Canadian Jews, there's an interesting study 3-4 years ago, comparing, they took the Pew study and they asked the same questions to Canadian Jews. What was really interesting was that on the whole, American Jews have a tendency to kind of single out one strand. I have a religious connection, I have a national connection, I would say. And Canadian Jews tend to have 2 or 3 strands.
Mhm.
And it's a much more robust form of Jewish identity. And so that's sort of like the meta critique that I'm just saying that to the extent that we buy into these Western binary choices, we weaken the beauty and the multiplicity and the multidimensionality and the messiness of our identity. I love mess. I love crossed wires. You should just see my desk.
What can I just, sorry, yeah. We again agree. We agree here. I'm still looking for where we disagree, because I completely agree with you, and I want to make it clear: there is no such thing as Zionism absent the Jewish religion, and there is no such thing as the Jewish religion absent the national aspect of Judaism. There was an attempt in Israel, as we discussed at the beginning, to de-religiousize Judaism and reduce it to a nation. That failed. Now we're back to like people consuming religious experiences, and there was an attempt in the United States to denationalize Judaism and reduce this to the Jewish church, and that has failed because Americans are evaporating. I think the more relevant Judaism becomes, then the more likely that people will consume other Jewish experiences. The Israeli supermarket of Jewish experiences has a lot of attractive products, be it Israeli wine or Israeli technology or Israeli series on Netflix, Fauda and Wonder Woman and Gal Gadot and a lot of other things, and criticism and Israeli, involvement and dissent and anger. The Jewish traditional religious, supermarket is based on customer loyalty. So the more people say, okay, I'm okay with feeling part of my, my Zionism is the anchor of my Jewish identity, the more likely they are to consume other experiences, including religious experiences. So I completely agree that, this is not, as Ben-Gurion, I think, said, Matanach lapalmach. We're not negating religiosity. We're just observing that let's say what I believe is the way it is, that the national aspect of Judaism is the most relevant aspect of Judaism de facto. That's how you're defined as a Jew through your relationship with Israel. So embrace it, criticize Israel, love Israel, be engaged with Israel, do whatever you want. But that's what I'm saying what the situation is.
All I would say, just one line, is that I also see that same supermarket of choices through Judaism, right? And that when we're
Religious
through what you call religiosity, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to avoid those terms. And so when we sit down at the Seder, will it be a religious moment or a national moment? I don't want to make the choice. I want to eat the Pesach version of the Oreo cookie. And I think there are sort of hydrox.
Perfect. So I think we should go into the audience and ask several questions.
Okay, can you hear me? Is it okay?
Yeah.
I won't. First of all, I want to thank you guys for dedicating your time to Jewish and Israel topics, because what they say with the Seder, there's the 4 sons, and then there's the 5th one, the one that's not even at the table. So thank you guys both for bringing out content and books that forces people to deal with Judaism and Israel. And so thank you on behalf of the Jewish people. And so my question is that how do we keep like the extremes in Judaism and in Zionism from overtaking the conversation? Because there's, let's say, a large majority that is, pro-Israel and pro-Judaism, but we don't hear from them. We hear from the extremes, right? Not every Jew in America, even secular, is part of Jewish Voices for Peace or J Street. Most of them find themselves in the center, maybe in one place or the other, a little bit closer to one side, but they're really kind of the center. But we allow these extreme voices, like in the terror attacks, right? Let's say, 70% of the Palestinian population doesn't support violence, or 80 or 90 or whatever it is, right? And so how do these outliers that actually do commit a crime all of a sudden take over the conversation of, will we have peace? Do we have neighbors? Whereas, in the same aspect, Jewish Voices for Peace in America doesn't necessarily represent all of secular Jews. So how do we keep those extreme voices from creating conversations that aren't really needed, but they're being had, or from taking over the conversation in general?
So who of you want to start?
So thank you for that, and thank you for those kind words. I'm with you completely. I think we have to find a voice, what I call the silenced majority. Richard Nixon talked about the silent majority, but we are totally in the era of the silenced majority. Jewish Voice for Peace is such a small percentage of Jews in America. The brutes who will yell Mavet Aravim. And so what are they saying about Amir Khoury and Yazan Fallah today? Is such a small percentage of Israel, right? And yet we let them run the conversation. And it's because of our laziness, because too many of us are busy watching Netflix and we're watching Fauda and we're not standing up and creating history. And we have to, Peter Beinart isn't American Jewry. And Peter Beinart doesn't express most American Jews, but of course he's also going to get the platform of the New York Times, because there's nothing more exciting than watching a Jew bash Israel. It's more exciting than somebody from the far left or from the far right running the conversation. And the media plays into that, and social media plays into it, and Twitter dumb, which I spelled D-U-M-B, plays into that. And we've all been sheep. We've all been passive. And I spend a lot of my time trying to find what I call that muscular moderate, that lively middle, that and I should give it a call out to Paul, who also does a lot of the very important work with that in his writings. And I think that's where we totally connect. And that's a very Herzlian move too, which is that we can't let the extremes run the conversation. And just a little point, during last May, when we saw the conversation completely being run about American Jewry by these academics who use the most horrific terms, settler colonialism and Jewish supremacy. Why don't we just use the initial Nazi terms, like I was saying? Be honest with where these words come from, and they're cliche, and they're not creative, and they're delegitimizing every which way. And so Natan Sharansky and I wrote an article calling them out as un-Jews. People say, "What? You wrote this book, Never Alone, where you stand up for Jewish unity. How dare you call them un-Jews?" I said, "How dare we not call them out?" And we needed to build a firewall. And what we're trying to do is create a language to say, "And why are you un-Jews? You're not," because you're saying as a Jew, right? You're not non-Jews. You're not ex-Jews. You're Jews who are trying to assert your power as professors, as rabbis, to undo this core relationship linking nationalism and religion and statehood. And I blame them for their extremism, but I also blame us for not standing up against this extremism.
So Paul, you have some questions from Zoom?
Yeah, there's a question here from Isabel Margolin, and it goes back to Gal, when you were talking about the secular, how in Israel today, secular aren't really secular, and Gil agrees with you essentially. She wants to know, where do Russian olim fit into this framework?
Tough question for you.
Well, it's exactly for the Russian, and I have a little section in the book. The Russian in general are not religious, and they are in the army, they are in the elite units, they're involved with Zionist thinkings. I'm sure a lot of you Russians here involved in the Begin Center. So they're just one of the examples of how people connect to their Jewish identity through the national aspect of Judaism, through Zionism. So I think the Russian example is a great example. They're in Judaism 3.0. And there are other groups that do the same. Same with farm workers that are here. They connect to the Jews, not to the Jewish religion. They're not trying to become, to convert, but their children speak Hebrew, sometimes the Hebrew names. So we see again and again in a lot of those groups that Zionism is the common denominator.
Sorry that I'm a little bit disagreeing.
Yes, please. But
because I
maybe we
think
should
that
do-
a
Do you want a
large-
microphone?
Sorry?
Okay, we'll repeat. Go ahead.
Sorry,
there-
I'm a little bit
Yes,
disagreeing because I think that there is a very, very big chunk in the Russian population that I totally agree with you that the majority is not religious. And for like maybe 3 generations are not religious, but many of them are not Zionists either. Many of them are. I'm not talking about Sharansky, and I'm not talking about this Russian intellectual elite that they came from St. Petersburg or Moscow or even Kiev from the Ukraine, and they had like a more motivated life and identity even back then. I see, like, for example, in the Israeli periphery, a lot of Russians that they not really identify with the ideas of Zionism. They live in the Israeli everyday life. Sometimes even there, they separating themselves a bit because they have like Russian stores and of course there are levels of identification. But I also could like mention a certain type of Russian-speaking population that they almost withdrawn from the Israeli society.
So if I can look, I mean, for this to work, for my idea to work, Zionism needs to be a really, really broad tent. We're not in a position to give grades to Zionism, just like when the religious aspect, I know really don't want the binary separation. People who are secular and atheists are still considered Jewish. People who are eating ham on Yom Kippur are considered Jewish by the outside and by themselves. So same with people today in Israel, and same with those American Jews that you've described that are anti-Israel. At the end, they're also Zionists. They may not say I'm Zionist, but they're defined by the outside, and even by their actions that they're complaining about Israel and even bashing Israel. They're not bashing the Jewish religion. They're not bashing, aspects of Jewish food or any other aspects of Judaism. They're bashing Israel. So that essentially is the relevant aspect. And the same thing.
So you speak about the reference point. Like
Yes,
the
I'm saying that those
reference
Russians that you
point.
described, the Russian-speaking population, that they're here in Israel, and I bet their connection to maybe it's a very weak connection, but their connection to Judaism is to the national aspect. Sometimes I like to say, for some of the American Jews, that Zionism is the least irrelevant aspect of your Judaism, but it's still the least irrelevant. And Zionism is a broad tent. In the last 3 events, I was introduced by a progressive political people who are progressives or involved in progressive politics in the United States. In the same week, day after day, that I spoke in a right-wing media place. I spoke in an Upper East Side liberal Jewish Reform synagogues. that's my point. I think Zionism can be the not just what's defined by the outside, that's how you define, by the outside that you're connected to Judaism, but could be a common denominator, even in dissent and even in agreement. So I don't want to, even maybe I found a little bit of a point that we finally disagree. The extremes, I don't think this is just centrist and we should give grades, or you like centrist. Everybody should be in, including people on the far right, left, far right. If you can be in by criticism, you can be in by support.
Well, any other question from Zoom?
Yeah, I have one more. I wanted to say, can I suggest that because people in Zoom, I think, are gonna want to leave soon, we can close formally, and then if people in the audience here want to continue asking questions, they can ask you informally afterwards. Is that okay with everyone? Just
Yes.
That's perfect.
So there's a question here from Jennifer. She says, do you see Judaism 3.0 as stronger, more durable, sustainable versus 2.0 or 1.0? And if so, why? Why?
Absolutely, because it's relevant. Judaism 1.0, was centered around the temple and the sacrifices and the physical presence here. The temple doesn't exist, the sacrifices don't exist. So Judaism evolved into something else with the religious aspect of it. The synagogue replaced the temple, the insular, as I like to say, replaced the physical presence here. The structural praise replaced the worship of the sacrifices. Judaism evolved, and something that was relevant to the Jews allowed Judaism to sustain in the last 2,000 years. Now, the most relevant aspect of Judaism, and I'm not saying it should be, I'm saying that's what it is Zionism, in positive and in negative. So for any entity to be relevant, or to exist, it needs to have relevancy and needs to have engagement. And Zionism draws engagement. Those people that you said are critical of Israel and should be un-Jews, they are engaged with their Judaism through Zionism, and those Russian speaking population that you refer to are engaged in one way or another with their Judaism through Zionism by virtue of living here or being here. So once there is a recognition that this is, the relevant aspect, then it creates engagements in other aspects as well, as we spoke earlier. So yes, Judaism 3.0 to me is the vehicle and the architecture for Jewish sustainability and continuity.
And let us say amen.
Perfect. Anyone else in the audience wants to engage? Perfect. So,
Okay, time or afterwards.
Maybe we can have conversation. Maybe we can formally close now, and then anyone who wants to ask questions now.
So-
For the Zoom people back home.
perfect. So I think it was a brilliant exposure of you two, and it has opened a varied of aspects to debate and to really delve into the future of Judaism. And I really want to thank you all
Thank you.
for joining us and for promoting this, and of course the audience. So this is officially closed, and now if you want to engage with Gil or Gol,
An after party.
an after party.